Have you ever wondered what happens when the most powerful woman in Britain meets a door she cannot open? When protocol trumps privilege, and even a queen consort must bow to rules written in stone? This is the extraordinary true story of a single afternoon that shook the very foundations of the British royal family, revealing the invisible boundaries that exist even within the walls of royalty itself. On a crisp October morning in 2024, Queen Consort Camilla approached the gates of Adelaide Cottage with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by palace security. What happened next would spark the most significant protocol crisis the royal family had faced in decades, forcing them to confront questions about hierarchy, tradition, and the delicate balance of power that keeps the monarchy intact. This is not just a story about a denied entry. This is a story about the moment when centuries-old traditions collided with modern expectations, when personal relationships clashed with institutional rules, and when the phrase, "Wales-only zone," became the most whispered words in royal circles. Prepare to discover the shocking events that unfolded behind closed doors, the conversations that were never meant to be public, and the lasting impact of one guard's unwavering commitment to duty over diplomacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Windsor Great Park as Queen Consort Camilla's sleek Range Rover approached the familiar gates of Adelaide Cottage. It was October 15th, and the autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of seasonal change. Camilla had made this journey countless times before, always welcomed with the respectful bows and warm smiles that had become second nature to the royal household staff. Today felt different, though. She couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the urgency in her step, or the weight of the conversation she needed to have with Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The two women had developed a complex relationship over the years, built on mutual respect, but shadowed by the inevitable comparisons that the media loved to draw. Camilla had specifically chosen this Tuesday afternoon because she knew William would be at his engagements in London, giving her the privacy she needed for what she considered a delicate family matter. As her vehicle approached the security checkpoint, Camilla noticed something unusual. Instead of the familiar face of James Morrison, the veteran guard who had been managing Adelaide Cottage security for over 8 years, she saw a younger man in the pristine uniform of the Royal Protection Squad. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses, and his hand rested professionally near his radio. The Range Rover came to a gentle stop, and Camilla's personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, rolled down the window. The interaction that followed would later be dissected by royal historians and protocol experts for months to come. "Good afternoon," Detective Inspector Williams said with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to these routine exchanges. "Queen Consort Camilla is here to visit the Princess of Wales." The young guard, whose name tag read Thompson, stepped forward with a clipboard in hand. His voice was steady and professional as he replied, "I apologize, but I'll need to verify the appointment. Do you have confirmation from the Princess of Wales's private secretary?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. In all her years of royal life, Camilla had never been asked for such verification when visiting family members. Particularly not at Adelaide Cottage, which had always operated under more relaxed protocols than the formal state residences. The cottage, after all, was meant to be the Wales family's private retreat, their haven from the ceremonial demands of royal life. Detective Inspector Williams shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been part of Camilla's security detail for 3 years and had never encountered such a request. "I'm sorry, but this is highly unusual. Her Majesty the Queen Consort doesn't typically require advance appointment confirmations for family visits." Guard Thompson consulted his clipboard again, his finger tracing down what appeared to be a detailed list of instructions. "Ma'am, I understand this may seem irregular, but I have specific orders regarding access to Adelaide Cottage. As of this morning, new security protocols are in effect. All visitors, regardless of their position, must have prior approval from either the Prince or Princess of Wales personally." Inside the Range Rover, Camilla felt a flutter of confusion mixed with something that resembled irritation. Through the bulletproof glass, she could see the guard's unwavering stance and began to realize that this was not a simple miscommunication. She leaned forward slightly, catching Detective Inspector Williams's eye in the rearview mirror. "Perhaps you could explain to the gentleman who I am," Camilla said quietly, her voice carrying the subtle authority that came with decades of public service and her recent elevation to Queen Consort. Detective Inspector Williams turned back to Guard Thompson, her tone becoming more formal. "This is Her Majesty Queen Consort Camilla, wife of His Majesty King Charles III. She is here for a private family visit with her daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales." Guard Thompson's expression didn't change, though a slight tension appeared in his jaw. Ma'am, I am fully aware of Her Majesty's identity, and I have the utmost respect for her position. However, my orders are explicit. Adelaide Cottage is currently designated as a Wales-only zone, which means access is restricted to the Prince and Princess of Wales and their immediate household staff. These instructions came directly from the Prince of Wales's office this morning. The phrase, Wales-only zone, seemed to echo in the confined space of the vehicle. Camilla had never heard such terminology applied to any royal residence, and the implications were both puzzling and, if she was honest with herself, somewhat hurtful. She had always prided herself on the respectful relationship she had built with William and Catherine, and this sudden restriction felt like a door being firmly closed in her face. "I see," Detective Inspector Williams replied, though her tone suggested she didn't see at all. "And when you say these orders came from the Prince of Wales's office, can you be more specific? Was this a directive from His Royal Highness personally, or from his private secretary?" Guard Thompson glanced at his radio, as if considering whether to call for backup or additional guidance. "Ma'am, I was briefed this morning by Chief Inspector Matthews, who received the orders directly from the Prince's private secretary. The directive was clear, no exceptions, no matter the circumstances or the individual involved." The weight of this statement settled over the occupants of the Range Rover like a heavy blanket. Camilla, who had navigated decades of royal protocol and understood better than most the delicate balance of hierarchy within the family, recognized that this was no simple security upgrade. This was a deliberate message, though she couldn't yet decipher its full meaning. She thought about the events of recent weeks, searching for any interaction or incident that might explain this sudden change in protocol. There had been the usual minor disagreements about scheduling and public appearances, the kind of logistical challenges that were common in any large family, particularly one under constant public scrutiny. But nothing that would warrant such a dramatic response. "Could you perhaps contact the cottage directly?" Camilla asked through the window, her voice maintaining its composure despite the growing awkwardness of the situation. "I'm certain this is simply a misunderstanding that can be resolved with a quick phone call." Guard Thompson nodded respectfully, but maintained his position.
"Of course, Your Majesty."
"I'll contact the cottage immediately." He stepped back slightly and spoke into his radio, his voice too quiet for the occupants of the vehicle to hear clearly. The conversation lasted several minutes, during which Camilla observed the guard's body language carefully. She had learned over the years to read the subtle signs of discomfort and uncertainty in those around her. When Guard Thompson returned to the vehicle, his expression was even more serious than before. "Your Majesty, I've spoken directly with the Princess of Wales' private secretary. She confirms that there are no scheduled appointments for today and that the Wales-only zone restrictions remain in place. She has asked me to convey her apologies but to maintain the security protocols as directed." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This was not a negotiation or a request for flexibility. This was a firm denial of access that would not be overturned by further discussion. Camilla felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Embarrassment at being turned away, confusion about the reasons behind this treatment, and a growing concern about what this might mean for family relationships moving forward. Detective Inspector Williams looked back at Camilla, waiting for guidance on how to proceed. The silence in the vehicle stretched on as Camilla processed the full implications of what had just occurred. She was not simply being denied entry to a building, she was being excluded from a space that represented the heart of the Wales family's private life. "I understand," Camilla finally said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Please thank Guard Thompson for his professionalism and adherence to his duties. We'll return to Clarence House." As the Range Rover began its slow turn away from Adelaide Cottage, Camilla caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upper windows. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure watching from behind the curtains, but the image was too brief and distant to identify clearly. The cottage, which had always seemed welcoming and warm during her previous visits, now appeared somehow fortress-like, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. The drive back to Clarence House passed in relative silence, each occupant of the vehicle lost in their own thoughts about the unprecedented events they had just witnessed. Detective Inspector Williams occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, noting the thoughtful expression on Camilla's face, and recognizing that this incident would likely have repercussions far beyond the simple denial of a visit. For Camilla, the journey home provided time to consider not just what had happened, but why it might have happened. She thought about the delicate dynamics within the royal family, the pressures that William and Catherine faced as the future king and queen, and the challenges of maintaining personal relationships within an institution governed by centuries of tradition and protocol. As Clarence House came into view, Camilla realised that this afternoon had marked a significant shift in her relationship with the Wales family, and she would need to decide carefully how to respond to what could only be described as a very public, very deliberate snub, delivered with perfect procedural correctness. The walls of Clarence House had witnessed many pivotal moments in royal history, but few conversations had carried the weight of the one that took place in Camilla's private sitting room that evening. The Queen Consort sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of Earl Grey growing cold on the table beside her, while she contemplated the afternoon's events with a mixture of analytical precision and personal hurt that she rarely allowed herself to feel. King Charles had returned from his environmental summit in Scotland later than expected, and Camilla had wrestled with whether to discuss the incident immediately or wait for a more appropriate moment. The decision was made for her when Charles noticed her unusually quiet demeanour during their private dinner, a meal typically filled with their customary exchange of daily experiences and gentle humour. "Something's troubling you," Charles observed, setting down his wine glass and studying his wife's face with the concern that came from decades of partnership. "You've barely touched your salmon, and you know how Chef Martin takes pride in his Tuesday evening preparation." Camilla looked up from her plate, meeting Charles's eyes with a directness that signalled the gravity of what she was about to share. "I need to tell you about something that happened today at Adelaide Cottage, something that I believe requires your immediate attention, not just as my husband, but as the king." The formality in her tone caused Charles to straighten slightly in his chair. Throughout their relationship, Camilla had always been careful to distinguish between personal matters and those that affected the crown, and her choice of words indicated that this fell into the latter category. She recounted the afternoon's events with the precision of someone accustomed to providing detailed briefings, omitting no detail from Guard Thompson's unexpected resistance to the mysterious figure she had glimpsed in the cottage window. Charles listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly serious as the full implications of the situation became clear. "Wales only zone?" Charles repeated, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "I've never heard such terminology applied to any of our residences, and I certainly haven't authorized any such designation. This is deeply concerning, not just from a family perspective, but from a constitutional one." The king rose from his chair and began pacing slowly around the dining room, a habit he had developed over the years when processing complex situations. "If William has indeed implemented such restrictions without consulting me, it represents a significant breach of protocol, but more troubling is what it might suggest about the current state of relationships within the family." Camilla watched her husband's measured steps, recognizing the internal struggle he faced between his roles as father, king, and head of a family that was also an institution. "I've been trying to understand what might have prompted such a drastic response," she said carefully. "The last time I spoke with Catherine was at the Balmoral gathering in September, and our conversation was entirely pleasant. We discussed the children's autumn term and her upcoming engagements. Nothing that would suggest any kind of tension." Charles paused in his pacing, turning to face Camilla with a thoughtful expression. "What concerns me most is the manner in which this was handled. If William or Catherine had concerns about visits or access, the appropriate channel would have been through my private secretary, or, at minimum, a direct conversation with you. To learn of such restrictions through a security guard at the gate is not just discourteous. It's potentially damaging to the Crown's reputation." The following morning brought no immediate answers, but it did bring Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, arriving at Clarence House earlier than his usual appointment time. His expression suggested that the previous evening's telephone briefing had prompted some urgent inquiries of his own. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began as he settled into the chair across from Charles's desk, "I've conducted preliminary investigations into the Adelaide Cottage situation, and I'm afraid the findings are quite complex."
The security directive was indeed issued by the Prince of Wales's office, but through channels that bypassed the usual coordination with the master of the household.
Charles set down his morning correspondence and gave Sir Clive his full attention. "Explain what you mean by bypassed the usual coordination." Sir Clive consulted his notes, his decades of experience in royal administration evident in the careful way he chose his words. "Normally, any changes to security protocols at royal residences are coordinated through the Master of the Household's office to ensure consistency and avoid conflicts with other family members' schedules and access needs. In this case, the directive went directly from the Prince of Wales' private secretary to the security detail, with explicit instructions that it was not to be shared with other officers until after implementation. The implications of this information settled over the room like a storm cloud. Charles had spent his entire life navigating the complex protocols that governed royal life, and he understood immediately that such an approach represented either a serious misunderstanding of proper procedure or a deliberate attempt to circumvent normal channels. "Has anyone from William's office provided an explanation for this unusual approach?" Charles asked, his voice maintaining its characteristic measured tone despite the gravity of the situation. "That's where the situation becomes even more concerning, Your Majesty," Sir Clive replied. "I've attempted to contact both the Prince's private secretary and his deputy to request clarification. Both have indicated that they are not authorized to discuss the matter and have referred all inquiries back to the Prince himself." Charles leaned back in his chair, processing this information with the analytical mind that had served him well throughout decades of public service. The behavior Sir Clive described was unprecedented in his experience and suggested a level of coordination that went well beyond a simple security upgrade or family disagreement. "I want you to arrange a meeting with William," Charles said decisively. "Not a formal audience, but a private conversation between father and son. This situation needs to be addressed directly before it escalates into something that could affect public confidence in the institution." While the King's private secretary began the delicate process of arranging a meeting that could address the situation, without appearing to undermine William's authority as Prince of Wales, Camilla found herself dealing with the personal aspects of the incident. Word of the Adelaide Cottage denial had begun to circulate within the royal household, as such news inevitably did among the staff who managed the complex logistics of royal life. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, one of Camilla's longest-serving ladies-in-waiting and a person whose discretion had been tested and proven over many years, approached the subject during their regular weekly review of upcoming engagements. "Ma'am, if I may," Lady Sarah said carefully, "there's been some discussion among the household staff about yesterday's events at Adelaide Cottage. Nothing inappropriate, you understand, but there's concern about how such situations should be handled in the future." Camilla appreciated Lady Sarah's diplomatic approach to what was obviously a sensitive topic. "What kind of concerns are the staff expressing?" "Well, ma'am, several of the protection officers are questioning whether the security protocols they've been following are still current. If different members of the royal family are implementing different restrictions without coordination, it creates confusion about their own duties and authorities." This perspective hadn't occurred to Camilla, but she immediately understood its significance. The royal household operated like a complex machine, with each component dependent on clear communication and consistent procedures. If individual family members began implementing their own separate systems without coordination, the entire structure could begin to break down.
There's also the matter of public perception, Lady Sarah continued gently.
While the incident itself wasn't public, the security staff involved work across different royal households. Information like this has a way of finding its way into unofficial channels. Camilla nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Lady Sarah's observation. "What do you recommend?" "Perhaps it would be beneficial to address the situation proactively, both within the family and with the senior household staff. If this was simply a misunderstanding, clarification could prevent similar incidents and restore confidence in the coordination between different royal officers." That afternoon, Camilla made a decision that would later be seen as a crucial turning point in the entire affair. Instead of waiting for Charles's diplomatic approach through official channels, she decided to reach out directly to Catherine through a method that bypassed all formal protocols and security considerations. She composed a personal text message, something she rarely did for family communications, which typically went through private secretaries or direct phone calls. The message was brief but carried significant emotional weight. "Catherine, I hope you and the family are well. I was disappointed not to be able to visit yesterday as planned. Perhaps we could arrange a time to talk privately. I value our relationship too much to let misunderstandings create distance between us. With love, Camilla." The decision to send such a direct message represented a calculated risk. If Catherine's response was positive, it could resolve the situation quickly and privately. If the response was cold or dismissive, it would confirm that the Adelaide Cottage incident was part of a larger, more serious rift within the family. For the next several hours, Camilla found herself checking her phone with an frequency that surprised her. She had faced down hostile media, navigated complex political situations, and managed countless public crises. But waiting for a response from her daughter-in-law about a family matter felt uniquely stressful. The response, when it finally came late that evening, was polite but distant in a way that immediately told Camilla everything she needed to know about the current state of their relationship.
"Hello, Camilla. Thank you for your message.
I think it would be best if family matters were handled through the appropriate channels. William and I are committed to following proper protocols in all our interactions. I hope you understand. Catherine." The formality of the response, The careful use of titles and protocol language, and the subtle reference to appropriate channels, made it clear that the Adelaide Cottage incident was not an isolated misunderstanding, but part of a deliberate approach by the Wales household to restructure their relationships within the royal family. As Camilla showed the message to Charles later that evening, both of them realized that they were facing a situation far more complex and potentially damaging than they had initially understood. The Wales-only zone was not just about access to a cottage, it was about power, autonomy, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. The October rain drummed against the windows of Highgrove House as King Charles waited in his private study for what would prove to be one of the most difficult conversations of his reign. He had chosen this location carefully, understanding that the informal atmosphere of his beloved countryside retreat might facilitate the kind of honest dialogue that the sterile formality of Buckingham Palace could inhibit. The room, filled with his personal books, organic garden photographs, and architectural sketches, represented the man behind the crown in a way that few spaces could. William arrived precisely on time, a habit inherited from his military training and refined through years of royal duties. His appearance was impeccable as always, but Charles noticed the subtle signs of tension in his son's posture, the way his jaw was set just slightly more firmly than usual, and the careful neutrality of his expression that suggested he had prepared for this conversation as thoroughly as he might prepare for a state dinner. "Thank you for coming, William," Charles said, gesturing toward the comfortable seating area near the fireplace rather than maintaining the formal distance of his desk. "I think we both understand why this conversation is necessary." William settled into the chair across from his father, his movements precise and controlled. "If this is about the Adelaide Cottage protocols, then yes, I expected we would need to discuss it eventually. I had hoped it might be handled through our respective private secretaries, but I understand your preference for direct communication." The formality in William's tone immediately signaled to Charles that this would not be the easy father-son conversation he had hoped for. Instead, it appeared that William was approaching this as a negotiation between institutional equals, a perspective that was both surprising and concerning. "The protocols themselves are not the primary issue," Charles replied carefully, settling into his own chair and maintaining the steady eye contact that had become his signature during difficult discussions. "What concerns me more is the manner in which they were implemented and the apparent breakdown in family communication that they represent." William's expression didn't change, but Charles caught a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested his words had hit their intended mark. "Father, I respect your position as head of the family, but I also have responsibilities as the Prince of Wales and as a father to George, Charlotte, and Louis. The decisions Catherine and I make regarding our family's privacy and security are made with those responsibilities in mind." The reference to his grandchildren caused Charles to pause momentarily, recognizing that William was positioning this not as a matter of protocol or family hierarchy, but as a question of parental authority and protection. It was a sophisticated argument that would be difficult to counter without appearing to dismiss William's legitimate concerns about his children's welfare. "I would never question your commitment to your family's safety and privacy," Charles responded, "but implementing security restrictions that affect other family members without coordination or explanation creates exactly the kind of uncertainty and division that could ultimately compromise everyone's security, including your children's." William leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the edge that Charles recognized from their few previous disagreements over the years. "With respect, the uncertainty and division existed long before the Adelaide Cottage protocols. What we've implemented is simply a recognition of realities that have been developing for some time." This statement hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Charles realized that they had moved beyond the specific incident to address much larger questions about the future of the monarchy and William's place within it. "What realities are you referring to, William?"
The reality that Catherine and I have different priorities and different approaches to royal life than some other family members.
"The reality that we need to establish clear boundaries to protect our children's childhood and our marriage from the kind of pressures and influences that have historically damaged royal families. The reality that we cannot continue to operate as if everyone's needs and goals are perfectly aligned when they clearly are not." Charles felt a familiar weight settling in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced during the most difficult moments of his own marriage breakdown years earlier. He was witnessing his son making decisions based on protection and control, strategies that Charles understood intimately but had hoped William might avoid. "Are you suggesting that Camilla represents some kind of threat to your family's well-being?" Charles asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the personal nature of the question. William was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering how much honesty this conversation could bear. When he spoke, his words were measured but decisive. I'm suggesting that different generations of this family have different relationships with the media, different comfort levels with public scrutiny, and different ideas about how much access extended family members should have to our private lives. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying message, and Charles recognized that William was drawing distinctions not just between generations, but between his father's wife and his own vision of how the royal family should operate. It was a perspective that was both understandable and deeply hurtful. Camilla has been part of this family for nearly 2 decades, Charles said quietly. She has earned her place through service, discretion, and genuine care for the institution, and for all of us personally. The treatment she received at Adelaide Cottage suggests a level of distrust that I find both unjustified and damaging to family unity. William's response came quickly, suggesting that he had anticipated this line of argument. This isn't about trust or distrust. This is about establishing clear systems and boundaries that will serve the monarchy well for the next generation and beyond. Catherine and I have decided that our family life requires more structure and more control over who has access to our private spaces and our children. Structure and control, yes, Charles replied, his voice taking on a slight edge despite his efforts to remain diplomatic. But structure that excludes family members without explanation or discussion isn't institutional strength. It's institutional fracturing. And fracturing, as we both know from family history, can become public very quickly. This reference to the very public family conflicts of previous decades caused William to shift uncomfortably in his chair, the first sign of uncertainty he had shown during the conversation. Charles pressed on, recognizing an opportunity to reach his son on a more personal level. I spent decades navigating family relationships while managing public responsibilities, and I learned that exclusion and secrecy create more problems than they solve. If you have concerns about how family relationships are affecting your household, those concerns deserve to be discussed openly, not addressed through security protocols and restricted access. William stood up and walked to the window, his back to his father as he looked out at the rain-soaked gardens. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that Charles hadn't heard before. Do you remember what it was like when George was born? The constant speculation about grandparent relationships, the media analysis of every family gathering, the endless comparisons between different family members' access and influence. Charles did remember, and he began to understand the perspective that had led to the Adelaide Cottage protocols. The birth of his first grandchild had indeed generated intense media interest in family dynamics, with every interaction analysed for signs of favouritism, tension, or shifting alliances within the royal hierarchy.
I remember the challenges, yes, Charles acknowledged.
But I also remember the joy and the sense of unity that George brought to all of us. Are you telling me that those positive experiences have been overshadowed by media pressures? William turned back toward his father, his expression more open than it had been since the conversation began. I'm telling you that Catherine and I have decided that we need to be much more intentional about how we manage those pressures going forward. The Wales-only zone isn't about excluding people we care about. It's about creating space where our children can be children, without every family interaction becoming a subject for public analysis. The explanation provided Charles with the context he had been seeking, but it also raised new concerns about the long-term implications of such an approach. I understand the desire to protect your children's privacy, but you must also consider how such restrictions affect family relationships and public perceptions. A royal family that appears divided or exclusive risks losing the public support that is essential to the monarchy's survival. William returned to his chair, his posture slightly more relaxed than before, but his expression still serious. We're not trying to exclude people permanently. We're trying to establish systems that allow us to include people intentionally, on our terms, in ways that serve everyone's interests, including the children's. And does Camilla understand that this is temporary? Does she understand the reasoning behind these decisions? Because from her perspective, and frankly from mine, it appears to be a personal rejection rather than an institutional policy. This question clearly struck at something William hadn't fully considered, and Charles watched his son process the emotional implications of decisions that had been made. From a purely practical perspective, I suppose we assumed that the family would understand that this wasn't personal, that it was about establishing better systems for everyone. William, you're going to be king someday, and one of the most important lessons of kingship is that perception often matters more than intention. If your actions are perceived as exclusionary or hurtful, those perceptions become political realities regardless of your actual motivations. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from the specific mechanics of the Adelaide Cottage protocols to broader questions about the evolution of the monarchy under William's future reign. By the end, Both men had gained a better understanding of each other's perspectives, though it was clear that significant differences remained. William agreed to have Catherine reach out to Camilla directly to explain their reasoning and to explore ways that family relationships could be maintained within their new security framework. Charles agreed to respect their need for greater control over their children's environment, while requesting that future policy changes be coordinated through proper channels to avoid misunderstandings. As William prepared to leave Highgrove, Charles made one final observation that would resonate with his son for weeks to come. The challenge of modern monarchy is maintaining the balance between institutional requirements and human relationships. If we protect the institution at the expense of the relationships, we may discover that we've preserved something that no longer has the heart that made it worth preserving in the first place. The drive back to Adelaide Cottage gave William time to consider his father's words and to contemplate the unintended consequences of decisions that had seemed entirely reasonable from within the protective bubble of his own family's concerns. He began to understand that the Wales-only zone, while serving his immediate goals, might require significant modification if it was to serve the broader needs of the royal family and the monarchy itself. That evening, as he discussed the conversation with Catherine, both of them began to grapple with the complexity of their position as future monarchs who were also parents, spouses, and family members, trying to navigate relationships that were simultaneously personal and institutional, private and public, traditional and modern. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. George's Chapel as Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked slowly along the peaceful grounds of Windsor Castle, her mind occupied with the conversation she knew she needed to have. It had been 3 weeks since the Adelaide Cottage incident, and the careful diplomatic discussions between the King and Prince William had created a framework for resolution, but the actual healing of relationships required something more personal and direct. She had chosen to meet Camilla at Windsor rather than either of their private residences, understanding that the neutral territory might help both women approach their conversation without the emotional weight of previous associations. The chapel grounds, with their centuries of royal history and their atmosphere of contemplation, seemed appropriate for a discussion that would need to address both past hurts and future possibilities. Camilla arrived precisely on time, accompanied only by her personal protection officer, who discreetly positioned himself at a respectful distance. The Queen Consort's appearance was carefully chosen for the occasion, elegant but understated, formal enough to show respect for the importance of the meeting, but casual enough to suggest a desire for genuine dialogue rather than ceremonial posturing. "Catherine," Camilla said warmly as they met near the chapel steps, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for suggesting this meeting. I've been hoping we could find time to talk properly." "Of course, Camilla," Catherine replied, accepting the handshake and noting the genuine warmth in the older woman's eyes. "I think we both understand that family relationships require more attention than either of us has been able to give them recently." They walked together toward a private garden area that Catherine had arranged to be available for their conversation, a space where they could speak freely without concern about being overheard or observed. The October afternoon was crisp but comfortable, and the seasonal beauty of the gardens provided a peaceful backdrop for what both women knew would be a delicate and important discussion. "I want to begin by acknowledging that the situation at Adelaide Cottage was handled poorly," Catherine said once they had settled onto a bench overlooking a small ornamental pond. "Regardless of our reasoning, you deserve better communication and more respectful treatment. The way you learned about the new protocols was inappropriate, and I apologize for that." Camilla appreciated the directness of Catherine's approach, recognizing that the younger woman was addressing the personal hurt before moving on to the practical considerations.
Thank you for saying that, Catherine.
"I won't pretend that the experience wasn't difficult, both practically and emotionally. But I'm more interested in understanding the reasoning behind the changes than in dwelling on how they were implemented." This response seemed to relieve some of the tension that Catherine had been carrying, and she found herself able to speak more openly about the pressures and concerns that had led to the Wales-only zone decision. "William and I have been struggling with how to balance our children's need for normal family relationships with the reality that every interaction becomes a subject for public analysis and speculation. I can only imagine how challenging that must be," Camilla replied thoughtfully. "When Charles and I married, the children were already adults, so we never faced the particular pressures of managing extended family relationships while trying to raise young children in the public eye." Catherine nodded, grateful for Camilla's understanding perspective. "The media attention around George's relationship with his grandparents has been particularly intense. Every photograph, every public interaction gets analyzed for signs of favoritism or family dynamics. We realized that we needed to be more intentional about controlling those narratives especially as Charlotte and Louis grow older and become more aware of public attention. That's a reasonable concern, Camilla acknowledged. But I hope you'll also consider that completely controlling those narratives might create new challenges. The public has always been interested in royal family relationships, and if those relationships appear to be artificially managed or restricted, that can generate its own kind of negative speculation. This observation clearly resonated with Catherine, who had been grappling with similar thoughts since her husband's conversation with the king.
We've been discussing that possibility, actually.
The feedback from the king's office has helped us understand that some of our approaches might be creating unintended consequences. They spent the next hour discussing specific concerns and potential solutions, with both women showing a genuine commitment to finding approaches that could address the Wales family's privacy needs while maintaining the broader family relationships that were important to the monarchy's public image and internal stability. Camilla shared her own experiences of gradually finding her place within the royal family, acknowledging the challenges she had faced in establishing relationships with William and Harry, while respecting their relationship with their late mother. Catherine, in turn, opened up about the pressures she felt as a future queen consort trying to establish her own identity while honouring the traditions and expectations that came with her role. One thing I've learnt over the years, Camilla said as their conversation began to wind down, is that royal life requires us to be more intentional about maintaining relationships than normal families need to be. The demands of our schedules and duties can easily create distance if we don't make active efforts to prevent it. I think that's part of what led to the Adelaide Cottage protocols, Catherine admitted. We were trying to create intentional space, but we didn't think carefully enough about how that might affect relationships with people we care about. As they walked back toward the chapel, both women had developed a clearer understanding of each other's perspectives and a shared commitment to finding better ways to balance competing needs and priorities. They agreed on several practical steps that could address the Wales family's concerns while restoring more normal family interactions. The most significant agreement involved restructuring the Adelaide Cottage protocols to create what Catherine described as scheduled family time, rather than blanket restrictions. Specific days and times would be designated for extended family visits, allowing the Wales family to maintain control over their schedule while ensuring that family relationships continued to develop naturally. 3 months later, the impact of these changes was evident in both the private dynamics of the royal family and their public appearances. The Christmas celebrations at Sandringham included carefully coordinated but natural-seeming interactions between all family members, with particular attention paid to ensuring that the grandchildren's relationships with both sets of grandparents were visible and positive. Camilla found herself with a more clearly defined role in her step-grandchildren's lives, participating in specific activities and events that allowed her to build genuine relationships with them without the constant pressure of media speculation about family hierarchies. The children, for their part, seemed to thrive in an environment where family relationships were more predictable and less subject to external pressures. The Adelaide Cottage incident had also prompted broader changes in how the royal family managed protocol and communication between different households. Sir Clive Alderton worked with his counterparts in the Prince of Wales's office to establish better coordination systems that could prevent similar misunderstandings, while respecting each household's need for autonomy in managing their own affairs. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis had forced all family members to be more explicit about their needs, concerns, and expectations, rather than assuming that others would understand their motivations intuitively. Regular family meetings, facilitated by senior staff when necessary, became part of their routine, creating opportunities to address potential issues before they escalated into public or personal conflicts. King Charles, reflecting on the entire episode months later, recognised that while the Adelaide Cottage incident had been personally difficult and institutionally challenging, it had ultimately strengthened the family by forcing them to develop better systems for managing the complex relationships. The Wales-only zone, which had begun as a defensive measure to protect one family's privacy, had evolved into a more sophisticated approach that balanced privacy needs with institutional requirements and family relationships. The term itself had quietly disappeared from royal household vocabulary, replaced by more positive language about family coordination and intentional relationships. For Camilla personally, the experience had been transformative in unexpected ways. The initial hurt and confusion of being denied access had given way to a deeper understanding of the pressures facing the next generation of royals and a more clearly defined role in supporting them while respecting their autonomy. She had also gained a renewed appreciation for the delicate balance required to maintain both institutional stability and personal relationships within the unique constraints of royal life. The conversation with Catherine had not only resolved the immediate crisis, but had established a foundation for ongoing dialogue about the challenges they would all face as the monarchy continued to evolve. The Adelaide Cottage gate, once a symbol of exclusion and family division, had become something different. A reminder of the importance of communication, understanding, and mutual respect in maintaining relationships that were simultaneously personal and institutional, traditional and modern, private and public. As winter gave way to spring and the royal family settled into their new patterns of interaction, the lessons learned from those difficult October days continued to influence their approach to the countless decisions and challenges that royal life presented. The Wales-only zone had ended not with dramatic confrontation or formal announcements, but with the quiet recognition that true strength, whether in families or institutions, comes from the ability to adapt, communicate, and grow together rather than apart. The story of that autumn afternoon at Adelaide Cottage would eventually be remembered not as a crisis that divided the royal family, but as a turning point that helped them develop the tools and understanding necessary to navigate the complex demands of modern monarchy, while preserving the personal relationships that gave meaning and humanity to their public roles.